So, welcome everyone. My name is Nancy Marco, and I am so happy and appreciative that you are showing up to be part of this intentional living circle tonight. Um, our free community offers many opportunities for you, and thank you for being here for this one. Also, our community it grows and it spreads by you sharing with other people who you know would enjoy these kind of events. Our speaker tonight is Bob Driver Bishop Robert, and I'm excited to introduce him to you. He's going to share with us about Celtic inner peace, group empowerment, and community transformation. I use the heading Celtic Enneagram. Bob is a Celtic expert, and we're going to learn a lot from him tonight. Before I introduce him, I just have a few little announcements and invitations. And the first one is to please add your desired pronouns to your screen name. This helps us to demonstrate our understanding of the importance of honoring diversity, that we find wholeness through really valuing the differences that we have. Manage your audio. You can use the Zoom raised hand if you have a question for Bob. Turn on your video if that's possible, because we love to see you. And do grab a pen and paper to take notes. So what is coming up next for connecting you with yourself in the intentional living circles, which are Tuesday nights from 7 to 9 Mountain Time, 11/12, the 12th of November, Elliot Killian, a member of our community, will be presenting on Enneagram fears and desires. Elliot is a very well-versed teacher of the Enneagram, and he does a podcast. I was privileged to be on his podcast recently. And then Kelly Benega, who is also a member of our community and a therapist, on the 19th is going to do a presentation on relationships that will launch a bi-monthly, I believe, relationship group that he will host on his own. And it will be supported through IEA Colorado. Yoga is going to happen this week, except for Halloween. I'm looking at having a different time. So no yoga on Friday. And the Empowered Living chats will happen on Friday. And we are going to explore what is the Enneagram, where did it originate, and how did it unfold? If you haven't already join Connecting You with Yourself on Facebook, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. So here, Bob, I have the little commercial for the upcoming event that Bob is doing on October 31st, and I'll put more information in the chat on that. But Bob shares that he is a Celtic coach and a workshop leader at spiritstrengths.com, but I think that changed now, but it still gets you there. You can go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, I prefer Celtic Courage now. That's
Yeah.
CelticCourage.com. That is more focused on what
More focused. It gets you there. Yeah, here comes some more people. So Bob's joining us from Maryland. He told me he's just had a long drive today, so really appreciate you still being here with us. Bob is also a retired evangelical Lutheran church minister, specializing in leadership development, executive coaching, public speaking, nonprofit consulting, management consulting, project management, life coaching, writing.
That's too much.
And
It's
content
okay.
strategy.
No,
Basically, Bob does everything. So on the screen is a promotion for an event that Bob is doing with a good friend, Osgood. I'm not even going to try to pronounce her last name. That is Osgood's from Turkey. Is she still in Turkey, Bob?
Oh,
Excuse
very
me,
much.
Nancy.
Okay.
There's nothing on my screen except a black square.
There's nothing on your
The same
screen.
here. I didn't want to
Hmm.
criticize. There it is.
There. Okay.
There.
Sorry. I
Thank
don't
you.
know. It disappeared. Helen, I love you. You always are speaking up, and I love that about you because I didn't know it wasn't there. All right. So
Let me say something while you have the screen up.
go ahead.
Why I'm doing Thursday is Michael Goldberg is the one who discovered that the Enneagram can be traced back to Odyssey. And he
Yeah,
published a book about that about the year 2000 or
yeah,
such. He was a law professor in DC, but he got early on the Enneagram. In fact, he taught the Enneagram to the intelligence community.
yeah. He was a
Um, the,
presenter for us
yeah,
about
okay.
2 or 3 years ago. I don't know if anybody who's watching right now was there, but yeah, he told us all about that. It's just an amazing, amazing
Uh,
man.
he's he's a gifted, caring scholar. And Anasku is from Turkey, but she's from the area where the Celts are from. In fact,
Wow.
she grew up in what I would call a Celtic village in the mountains. And she is a very well published Celtic archaeologist.
Yeah,
So
I knew
she
that.
brings
Yeah,
a lot of Celtic because a lot of people forget that Galatians was written to people, Celtic people in Turkey.
yeah.
And there's been thousands of years of people. Well, we'll get into that later.
Okay. Okay. So, well, I was just going to talk about how Bob and I met through the International Enneagram Association. Um, just immediately connected. He's a participant in several of the events that we have connecting you with yourself offers. And Bob's going to guide us in our centering practice today. So I love learning from Bob, and I know you will too. So thank you, Bob, for sharing with us tonight, and let me know how I can assist you. And let
Thank
me
you. Well,
take
I'll begin
down,
by sharing.
okay. Yeah, let me take
Um,
down mine.
and do you see this?
Yes, I do.
Okay. I have the image of a tree, which is a ever important image for Celtic tradition. You may have seen this over time. But today I want you to look and contemplate on four elements that are important. The first is the leaves. And the leaves could be best understood in the Celtic or Celtic tradition, however you want to pronounce it, as representing each of us, you and I. If you look at a tree, truly examine, you'll find every leaf is different, just like every snowflake is. But here's the important thing: every leaf has an important function for the greater whole. It is the different leaves that provide the connection with sunlight. And in order to nurture the tree as a whole and nurture each other, it's sort of like in giving that you receive. A reference to St. Francis of Assisi here. But I find that very true in the Celtic tradition is that when we are connected to a greater whole in a healthy receiving and giving modality, we thrive. The branches connect the different leaves, and they represent different groups, organizations, communities that we belong to that bring us together. Right now, tonight, even though there's just a few of us and possibly some later with the recording, we are connected as a branch. And in a larger scheme, we're connected, say, by the yoga community, international Enneagram community, people who live around the world, humanity itself. There are so many different ways of looking, but it's our connections with each other that, just like the leaf, help feed. The branches are the systems by way that enable that interconnectedness. And some are bigger than others, but each have an important function. What we're missing so much in our world today are our roots. I'll never forget Alex Haley's book, Roots, where he's trying to search for his past. And he goes back to Africa, this retired Navy seaman who wants to get back to his origins. He knew his family had come from Africa, and he found the village where they were from. And he met the storyteller, and how he had to sit with the storyteller for hours and hours until the storyteller came to the part of the story about his ancestor, Kintukunte. The thing is, it is by stories that we are linked together. It is also our stories, our histories as individuals, as humanity. And it is those stories, as we connect with our ancient past and those who have gone before us, that are truly our roots. I have the heart here because there is a benevolence that you will find in nature, that the different elements of the tree help each other. But one of the most fascinating things that scientific research has shown us is that in a given grove of trees, all of the trees are connected by mycelium, which is a natural element such as mushrooms or such, or underground living organisms. And here's the fascinating thing: we're able to prove that they can communicate with one another, that they give each other a helping hand, a warning signal wherever it is possible. And sometimes it's even that mycelium that provides healing. As we enter in tonight and we look at this ancient practice, think about how important you are as an individual, your gifts, and the groups that you belong to. Hopefully, they are healthy and nourishing and provide the opportunity for you to both give and receive. But also our roots, that which connected us. You know, the DNA scholarship is now showing that 1 million years ago, there were only about 1,000 humanoids or humans as we would know it, or the early hominoid that existed. We are a very fragile and delicate species. And it has been over time working together that has made all the difference in the world for our survival and ability to survive, to thrive. It fascinates me as a spiritual anthropologist who's had the blessing and the opportunity to visit all kinds of different faith groups and religious orders, that they, with consistency, talk about the body, mind, heart, and spirit. They may use different words, but when you do a deep dig, you find that so often they're talking about the same thing. For those of us who are familiar in the Enneagram world, we're familiar with the body, mind, and heart. And I want to put to you that what's often called instincts is actually has a spiritual element, and I'll get to that in a little bit. It was about halfway through the pandemic, many of us in the scientific world were just kind of floored by a book that was released called The Dawn of Everything. And if you look at the picture in the upper right-hand corner of the upside down pyramid, it literally turned a lot of stuff upside down as far as people's research and understanding of history. You have here a gifted anthropologist and a historian, and they are both members of the London School of Economics. And I just want to underscore why the London School of Economics. Well, their motto in Latin basically says, we can figure out how things work. And what they had spent many years delving into scholarship is where humanity, civilization as we understand it, first developed. And their message was so welcome because for many of us, we had seen signs along this way for quite a number of years. If you saw the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, it basically contends the beginning of civilization is people beating up each other, one ape party beating up on another. And there is this understanding that we have always been a violent people who war against one another. And what we're finding out with archaeology and DNA and language research and other things, it's all coming together, is that's not the case. Something went wrong about just over 4,000 years ago. I'll get that into a minute. But what I believe what they're getting at is for hundreds of thousands of years, we have developed as a species. But somewhere along the line, our programming got corrupted. Let's say a virus. A person who picked up on this same thing, and he refers to it in his book that came out just over a year ago, is Dr. Dan Siegel. Dan Siegel is one of the leading neurological researchers in the world. He's distinguished professor of the American Academy of Psychiatrists. What I believe Dan has done in his research is just as Isaac Newton kind of conceived how the motions of heavenly bodies connect with one another. In a parallel way, Dan Siegel has dedicated his life and research, and I tell you, he's very well respected, but he has helped us understand the interrelationship between each other as humanity. And in his writing, he points out how important it is for us to be connected, body, mind, heart, and spirit within ourselves and within each other. This whole concept of body, mind, spirit, the mind, let me just say, sometimes is classified as thinking. The heart, often as feeling or relationships as we connect with other people. The body is how you're comfortable. You know, move around in your chair a little bit. That's part of the body. But I think Carl Jung got at something, and certainly Naranjo agreed, is the body also represents our connectiveness with humanity. This is where our roots come in. I heard Aranio Pius one time saying that the difference between the three is that when it comes to the body, you can make a decision like that. You move in a millisecond. With the heart, it's going to take 10 times longer because you're going to consider the impact of this decision on different relationships that you have. And I'm just talking about averages here. But the mind will take 100 times longer because it's looking at all the possible permeations. The fear factor enters in. Is this the right decision? Weighing this one against the other. And at the end of the day, yes, a very important decision. The important thing is we need all three. We need to be able to look at the big picture, do the analysis. We need to consider others, our family, our friends, our neighbors, humanity itself in our decision. But we actually need to do something. Be engaged. As I was saying before, when it comes to the Enneagram, there's the protective, then there's the social, and then there's what some call the transmitting and sexual. For me, that's where the spirit is. And what I mean by is when it comes to you personally, what helps you rise up? What helps elevate you as an individual? that inspiration. The spirits at play when we come together, the social element. And then the spirit is when we offer to the world. If you were to think of it, let's just say in the Enneagram, we have the 2, 3s, and 4s are the heart. The 4s have their heart to themselves and have a great sense of history, of things that have happened in the past. And that continues to influence them. The 3s are committed to community. Yes, there's the downside, looking good and be willing to do whatever it takes. But the holy 3, the high 3, is concerned about social, protecting, caring for the community, enabling healthy commerce so that everybody is fed. And then the 2 of the heart are those that are reaching out to give that helping hand, maybe helping healing. I want to underscore that the oldest hospitals that we have in history are often of Celtic origins. Someone who's really helped us understand ancient times was Professor Miguel Seville. He taught at the University of Chicago when I was there getting my advanced degrees. But what's fascinating about him is his greatest research on ancient people actually accelerated after he retired between the ages of 70 and 90. And he was able to break ancient codes of understanding cuneiform and languages in ways that we had not seen before. It was this culmination of genius. He was originally Basque from Spain, went to Chicago, and then he returned to the University of Barcelona, and that's where he worked his last 25 years. Unfortunately, we just recently lost him, but truly a gifted man, a genius, a dedicated one over the years. What he helped translate us was about the ancient people of Sumer. Often when we talk about Mesopotamia, we look at the lower part of Mesopotamia, and we look at that's where the Sumerians came from. And often this is identified as the place of where civilization came from. And it's called Mesopotamia because it's between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Meso means, Potamia simply means between the two rivers, Meso between Potamia River. What a lot of people have missed over time, though, is that while there were Sumerians in this area, they were also throughout Turkey. I've been throughout Turkey looking at the archaeology, the museums and such like that. And you see the rivers of Mesopotamia went all the way up into Turkey. And one of the most fascinating places is right here in the corner where the rivers are kind of at their peaks, because that is a place you have probably heard of before. That's where Gobekli Tepe is. One of the original constructs of humanity that predated the pyramids by 7,000 years. What I'm fascinated about the Sumerians is they often worked in stone and working underground. One of their greatest accomplishments was building this ziggurat or temple. And this was made many hundreds of years before the pyramids. And unlike the pyramids, there were no slaves. It was volunteer by the community working together. One person who's helped us really understand this, and this is who I want to be when I grow up, is Gaia Vince, even though she's 20 odd years younger than I. She is just a gifted scholar. She wrote Transcendence. Actually, it came out the month the pandemic hit and everything shut down. And she's done other research. She is a professor with the University of London, but more importantly, She was for many years chief editor of Nature magazine, which is the ultimate peer-to-peer scientific review magazine. They have very tough standards, and that is actually, Nature has been a source for much of my research, because I know that their research is reliable, often from respected academic institutions. But it's in Transcendence that she brings out that how people work together to change the world, and the modality that they used, the tool that they used, was stories. She makes the point in this book that we as humanity need stories. It helps us to develop as individuals, but it has helped in the development of civilizations and even humans themselves. In fact, she says that we are hardwired for stories. And that's a fascinating thing, because it has been stories from ancient Sumeria that we hear that they were tradition. In fact, let me go back to this slide. I believe that this temple was a theater. And please understand, I'm not saying this out of nothing. I mean, this is where my advanced degrees in doing analysis of how people develop spiritual practices in modern and ancient times. But I believe it has 3 staircases, but it enabled large groups to hear a messenger. I find stories are very important, and these are 2 authors who talk about the importance of this balance of body, mind, and heart, and also stories. When often I'm working with people who are new to the Enneagram, I give them a copy of B and Aranio's book, The Enneagram Guide to Waking Up, because in it are only 9 chapters. And you'll never guess what type chapter 1 is about. Nancy, I'm going to give you a real test here. Who do you think chapter 2 is about? Obviously, 2.
Type 2. Me.
Yeah. Amen. What I also love, though, is that they begin each story with like a 5-page story, every chapter with a story. And what I do is I invite people who are new to the Enneagram, just read the story at the beginning of each chapter. And when you get to a story that clicks with you, then read the other 25, 30 pages and understand that. And often they have the experience I've heard in the Enneagram community. They feel like they're naked in the Garden of Eden. And how do you know this about me? I mean, that's usually a pretty clear tell. But with each type, there is beauty. With each type, there is good. But with each type, there is the downside. Sometimes it can be bad, sometimes ugly. It's almost like if we take a gift too much to an extreme, well, that's where we experience our downsides. When Gurdjieff first appeared on the scene in 1912 in Europe, he attracted a large group because the world was on the verge of a war. You could feel it in the air. And he had already experienced it, because there were things going on in Turkey that would take probably another lecture to get into. But the world was beginning to boil because change was happening. Often we find significant changes in world cultures after development of communication. And at that time, just over 100 years ago, with telegraph and radio just on the horizon, people were beginning to listen or connect to each other in ways that they had not before. And also, the old order of royalty was beginning to fracture and crumble. And it was at this point that war was on the horizon. And he said, I have a better way. And it goes back to, listen to this. This is his own words, to ancient Sumeria. I have lessons to teach you. What I'm fascinated about this temple in Samaria, and we have this now from the writings because of Miguel, is the bottom part of this temple had 7 million mud bricks that were all made by hand. And they formed the volunteers in groups of 10 and 50, and they were all men because men have 15% extra body weight or energy, and they were the ideal workers for that part of the project. And all of the supervisors were women. What we find in ancient societies, like Sumer, is equanimity between the sexes. In fact, in ancient Sumerian, there wasn't even a word for gender. I know that I have he, him here, but they didn't get into that because everybody stood at their own, and there was no locking people into boxes, let's say. In fact, the more I've studied Sumerian and those that have had the attitudes of sexuality are not the puritanical ones that maybe some of us have known in parts of this world or in America. What I find fascinating is before written history, these are some of the things that came to us that developed before the Greeks, before the Romans: mathematics, astronomy, farming, alphabet, language, writing, metallurgy. The concept of GPS, the locations that they use, was all developed back then. Time, even breaking time down into 60 minutes and 60 hours, all came before written history from the time of Samaria in Mesopotamia. Architecture, cities, ceramics, the wheel, mapping, hydraulics, chariots, domestication. You know, it's interesting to me. I was at a display about a year and a half ago with Ross Hudson and Susan Dion. And at that was at the J.P. Morgan Museum. And they had a big sign that said the beginning of civilization, and they were tracking it 4,000 years ago. But that's not what civilization means. It doesn't mean big buildings or empires or conquering others. The ancient Indo-European word civilization means to treat each other with respect, with honor. Men, women, people from all cultures, all walks of life, to see the divine in each other. I took this picture in Turkey last October, and it's a Sumerian symbol. And it's known as their tree of life. But what has struck me in looking at it is the threes that are there. And on the top, there are 9 symbols. To this day, archaeologists, anthropologists have no idea what this means. I mean, I've read the literature, but I can't help but wonder, is this related to the 3 parts of the body, mind, heart, and spirit? You know, for the inner heart, the group heart, or the world heart, that's 3 right there. For the inner thinking, the 5, the group thinking, which is the 6, or the world thinking is the 7, or the body, those 3. The inner body, which is organizing how things should be done. The group body, which is the 9, looking over and caring for others. And then finally, the 8, which is the type of body that steps out there to make a difference. Here's another picture that I've seen. And once again, this didn't come with a user's manual. At this point, I'll be very candid. It's just educated guess, but you know, it could be seen as the 3, or if you consider the spirit element, you have the additional 3 there. the inner, the body, and our. And once again, this is literally from 7,000 years, 5, 6, 7,000 years ago, is when these were made and we've been able to recover them. For me tonight, I'm helping you focus on what in ancient times was called Asia Minor. Today, parts of this is Turkey and Armenia. But what we're able to tell is there was a certain point about 50,000 years ago that there was a significant group that came out of Africa, out of Ethiopia, and they went up into other parts of the world. But this would have been one of the areas and why it was attractive. And what I can't help notice is to this day, the birds fly every year back and forth from the waters in Ethiopia up to here, which was known as the Black Sea. This was not in ancient times called the Black Sea. Its name was Pontus Iosenius. And it is around here that all those descriptions, or the vast majority of them that I was describing, those inventions and creativity from humanity, they mostly came from around the Black Sea, if you trace it down. In fact, as I've studied this over thousands of years, I have found that the people along here were known for hospitality, that they connected with other parts of the world. And I'll get more into that. But you see, the Black Sea connects to the Danube, which ran all the way through Europe. And then it connected with the Volga and other waters that went up into the Russias. And you had a pathway around the world. And we know that early travelers came from this area because up in the mountains here, particularly around this eastern edge of the Black Sea, is where Scottish pines originally came from. And we know that they used Scottish pines to build their canoes for one very good reason. A pine tree automatically has waterproofing as part of the tree because of its resin. The pine oil protects it. And we have found canoes from well over 10,000 years ago. In fact, one of my favorite, well, I'll get into that in a second. DNA research now shows us that the vast majority of people who claim that their ancestors came from Europe and Eastern Europe actually came from Anatolia here. DNA establishes beyond a shadow of a doubt. And they migrated out from this point. Why would they gather here? Because the Black Sea is one of the deepest lakes in the world, over 7,000 feet. And in a time of global climate change, and there's been a lot of changes in the past 20,000 years. But during time of change, it is a place like this that would be warm in the winter and a bit cooler in the summer, because that's what bodies of water do for you. And also we can tell by researching along the shores that this was a cornucopia, a basket of civilization. It's its name that intrigues the heck out of me. Pontus means the way, the pathway. Iosenio means generosity, is my best translation. Xenios means hospitality, but you is a modifier, like euphoria is the best feeling possible. Eureka is the best discovery. And Eusenio is the best hospitality possible. And that I find to be generosity itself. In fact, we have gone into the Black Sea. This is a picture taken by the same equipment that discovered the Titanic years ago, so that they could make a lot of good movies for the the public. But this they were able to test is over 15,000 years. There are marks of civilization down there 15,000 years ago. So why don't we know about what happened there? Well, 8,000 years ago, 6,000 BC, all the waters on the earth rose about 250 feet because of global warming. We are now in a warming cycle. The world goes through cycles every 20,000, 21,000, and every 100,000 years. And this can go back. We've been able to trace it millions of years. It happens again and again. But what happened is, at this point, the world was warming. At this point, where New York is, there were hundreds of feet of ice above New York. And when that water melted around the world, it raised the waters. And what civilization would have been around the Black Sea or Pontus Eugenius spread out. And it's exactly 8,000 years ago that humanity began to spread out. Much of what we know as Western society and culture. The East is something else, and that's another lecture. But there was integration of the two because right here in Turkey was part of the Silk Road. So we have connections that were going back and forth. But we can now trace languages 8,000 years ago from here. DNA shows us that it all came from this area 8,000 years ago. Archaeology, all the sciences are coming together to show this is where we need to look for at least the origins of civilization and an important step for what we know as humanity. What I'm intrigued here is 8,000 years ago, there were groups that sent all the way out to China. There were groups that went all the way out through Europe. And there were groups that even went back to Africa. So it was like a spreading out. The pathways that they used were waters. The Danube flows through much of Europe and it connects to the Rhine. And then the Rhine is actually Celtic, ancient Celtic, for the way to the sea. So if you were from Turkey and you wanted to get to Ireland or Scotland, you'd travel through the Danube. In ancient times, they were connected. They've been reconnected in modern times. But then you take the Rhine up, you make a left, and there you are. And what we understand is there was commerce going on. If you look at the waterways that were able to spread out, they were able to go all throughout Eastern and Western Europe. Often we have a way of focusing on just the Mediterranean, but what we're finding is there was a thriving life and people who were living in Northern Europe and spreading throughout the world. One group that was inheritors of the Sumerians were the Celts. And this is from 2,500 years ago. In the green is where Celts lived throughout Europe. Did you know this? I mean, this was shocking to me when I found out. I thought Celts were only parts of Ireland, a little bit of Scotland, but that was not the case. In fact, most of humanity, and what has been shown to us, is that Celts weren't always by blood. There were some people who adopted Celtic way because it was a philosophy of life, a culture that developed. And what we know from our research is that these people lived healthy, collaborative, cooperative life, that they had both women and male leaders in equanimity. Both were fully respected. And I think that contributed to their well-being. In that book, I talked about The Dawn of Everything, they talk about how these ancient practices and tribes are much better than the lives we live today. Something happened about 4,000 years ago that messed with humanity, and we're continuing to claw our way back. One person who's very helpful in understanding the Celts is Julian Osborne McKnight. She teaches at a Catholic university in Pennsylvania. She's been teaching Celtic history in America for 3 decades. She's head of their humanities department. And if you want to know more about Celts, at least from Ireland and American perspective, and she even gets into much of what I'm talking about, she's very helpful. Another person who's very helpful too is Jennifer Paxton. She's Harvard educated professor at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. And she teaches this course as part of the Great Lecture Series. You can get it on Amazon or Apple, but you can rent it or buy it. It's about 6 years since he's done it, and we've made a number of new discoveries. But in her 24-odd episodes, she does a very good job of archaeology and much of what I'm talking about or been discussing about their history. The one thing that I really love, though, is Brehon Law. It is said that when St. Patrick got to Ireland as he returned as a priest, he worked closely with the religious or the spiritual leaders, and he asked them to write down all of their rules and regulations. And that became what is known as Brehon Law. Later autocracies, dictatorships, would you say, like English law came in, and they forbade people from using Brehon Law because it was too generous. They wanted to use the power of enforcement and what I would call male domination. But Brehon Law is fascinating. You can get a copy of this for just $3 or $4 on Kindle. The copy that I like is Grinnell's, 1834. He was the first Irishman who was asked to be a member of Parliament. And he was also an attorney. And he had a very wicked sense of humor because here he's joining the English establishment, and he wanted the English people to know he had a better way. And what I love about Brehon Law, and you can read it for yourself, I mean, there are many scholars who say, and I feel the same, that I've studied ancient documents from 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago for much of my life. And many scholars say that this has elements from the Bronze Age, from ancient times. What I love about it is the importance of generosity, of hospitality to one another. In fact, every village needed to have an empty home for a traveling group to show hospitality, and every home needed to have an empty bed. And that's important, and it goes to the heart of something. 2,000 years ago, the Celts that were living in Turkey, I read that sometimes they spoke up to 24 different languages. Why? Because they were traders, they were merchants, but they were open to new possibilities and ways of thinking. Their minds open up. And I want you to know that is what contributes, as Dr. Siegel says, is to brain plasticity. In fact, what I've noticed over humanity is that with ancient Sumerians and earlier people and ancient Celts is their brains were larger, 10 to 15% larger than ours. But I think that's because they were constantly exercising, considering new possibilities, new things. Brehon Law underscores this. In fact, one thing I love is if someone sins against the community, instead of locking them up for years, they earn their way back into restoration with community by performing acts of benevolence. It's almost like jump-starting their relationship with each other. Because as Dr. Siegel points out, it is generosity that is the basis of our development as humanity. It is generosity that has enabled our development as humanity. These are just a few key things I've done in my reading of ancient Celtic traditions, and just for your, edification, if you will, but about empowerment. They weren't interested in having personal power. They were interested in sharing power with one another. Women's equanimity. In fact, recent research is showing us that countries led by women do better than countries that are not. And there's an excellent Wall Street Journal article about a year ago that pointed out that during the pandemic, the countries that were led by women had better survival rates, better health, and better wealth. They did better financially. That same Wall Street Journal article also pointed out they researched all the major corporations in New York and found that the more women who were in executive level, the higher the profitability and the health of the organization is. It isn't that women need, I guess what I'm trying to get at is humanity needs to recognize the powerful force of all of its members as we face the problems and the crises ahead of us. Everyone made a difference in the Gaelic communities. There was always this journey to wholeness, completeness, and this journey home to those that you connected with. The word mentor came from Celtic sources for the first time in human history. They celebrated all cultures, all people. In fact, this is an interesting thing. One of the oldest people from Anatolia who made it to Wales is called Cheddar Man. And they did the DNA on him. He was 10,000 years old, and he was African American. He was black, and he had blue eyes. Because 10,000 years ago, everyone living in Europe and in Anatolia was black. It has only been in the past several thousand years that the white pigments have begun to set in. And I can refer you to different scholarly works and scientific studies and DNA analysis. But we're all one humanity. It depends where we live, vitamin D, the diet that we have, a number of contributing factors lead to the skin. But human beings continue to evolve depending upon where we live. There was also this value of inner and shared peace, the hospitality I talked about, generosity, and the economic. One person I want to underscore, and if you really want to get into some of the history that I'm talking about, I think this is one of the most gifted Celtic scholars today. Dr. John Newell was a professor at Dublin. He also was ordained in the Presbyterian Church. But what really made him relevant to the Celtic tradition is not that he's just from Scotland, but that he was called to be the chaplain of Iona, which was a major center for the Celts from Ireland and Scotland going back a couple thousand, well over 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. In fact, we have found archaeology going back many thousands of years there. And it's on the coast of Scotland, but it was kind of a launching point And actually, they were able to go from there to parts of Europe. And there are some who said even made it to the Americas. What I love about his writings, though, is that guess what? How many chapters do you think his books have, Nancy? 9.
Fine.
And if you look at each chapter, the number, it will match the theme of the Enneagram. And, I was with him, last week. But a while back, I asked, why did you do that? He says, it's the Celtic way. It's the Celtic way. Someone who's been very important to the Enneagram community was Claude Naranjo. Before he introduced the Enneagram, he was probably one of the most famous psychiatrists in the world because he was the leader of what was called Gestalt therapy. He was so gifted that he was a Fulbright scholar who taught at Harvard, was a close friend of Paul Tillich, who I consider to be a Celtic theologian, but then he got a Guggenheim Fellowship. So that, he was respected by some of the greatest scholars in the world. But as many of us know, he went through a personal crisis and realized all his teaching and learning wasn't helping him. And he got the help of a Chazo, who was able to connect him with some of Gurdjieff and other teachings. But what Claude Naranjo realized is this connected with modern psychology. Some of you may be familiar with the diagnostic manual that is used by psychiatrists around the world, DSM-2, 3, 4, and 5. Where did this come from? After World War II, psychologists went out and interviewed a lot of the people who had gone through trauma and crisis, and they began to notice certain unhealthy patterns, and they began to break them down. Guess how many different types that they came up with? I'm sounding like a broken record, but it's there, 9. And what Claude realized is that what this independent scientific research that had included listening to hundreds of thousands of people and put together by caring professionals matched up what with Gurdjieff and Achazo and others had been saying all along. In essence, what I try and tell people when they ask me about the Enneagram is it's 100% natural. Because by listening to each other, we are part of nature. Each one of us is a blessed part of nature. And we listen to ourselves and listen to each other, we begin to notice these patterns. I'm going to skip through this. I think we're really beginning to consider most of how humanity developed. But I turned to Göbekli Tepe some 12,000 years ago. And once again, it's between the Mesopotamia rivers. And what I can't help but think as I've studied and viewed and I've seen is that this was an ancient theater for telling stories. And what's interesting is if you look at the different pillars, these were all of different objects that were threats to them, that threatened their existence. And humanity has always used stories as a vehicle to figure out a way through a problem, to work together to find a solution. I'm convinced that much of this was a place that they gathered together to share those stories. And why would they gather here? Because I want to come back to this for a second. If you notice, right here is Göbekli Tepe, and you see it between the rivers. Some of you can see that. This was a major migration point. In the spring, the animals that were living in the south would move north because all of Turkey is a half mile up. It's mountainous area, and that is where greenery would flourish, and they could enjoy the spring and the summer. In the fall, we know, and this is going back not tens of thousands, but hundreds of thousands of years, they would come back the other way. What for many years, this area, Göbekli Tepe and surrounding areas, it was a major meeting point as different tribes and people would come together to catch. When we say hunter-gatherer, it didn't mean that they had to go out and hunt meat every day. We know that they were making jerky and preserving meat tens of thousands of years before. And they would come to the place where they'd make the greatest catches. And in doing study of surrounding areas and looking at scholarship, I've often noticed that they build holes in the ground. So as the animals come running by, they would fall into the holes and they would be able to, well, kill them and then make meat. And that takes an extensive period of time. And during that time, they could gather and share stories. It was a gathering of the tribes of the clan. This area is very important because it is from this crossroads of humanity that the three world religions emanated from. Because if you go to Göbekli today, you're going to pass right by Haran, where Abraham was from. Abraham is someone who left this area and was seeking freedom. Why was he seeking freedom? Let me get into the description here. Because this is who Ross Hudson and Susan Dion and I met with, Sophus Heli. He is a gifted ancient scholar of Mesopotamia and related cultures. And just about a year ago, a year and a half, he published about Enhetwana. And it's referred to she who writes. She is the first person in ancient history who is identified as an author of anything ever written. And while that is a great and noble thing, her family helped destroy the world that we know. Enhetwana, I have no doubt, was a very gifted person. But it was her father, Sargon the Great, who first instituted slavery as an economic function. What had happened is they had begun shortly, about 4,500 years ago, there was a major global warming. And some people spread out along the waterways and found different ways to survive. But we know that the Akkadian Empire decided to enslave the Sumerians. These people who had given humanity so much. And by crushing them, it lifted up the Ugaritic people, but it also started a model of how to build an empire by enslaving others. And what I can't help but notice, it was from that point on that men started treating women as lesser. It began with the laws from the Ugaritic people. It continued with Hammurabi. It went to the Assyrian and the Babylonians and to the Greeks and the Romans. All of them were cultures that were very oppressive. At times, people claimed that they were great civilizations. But I tell you, any civilization that puts others down, enslaves them, is one that is headed or destined for destruction. And it happens again and again and again. I mean, there's not enough time, but there are dozens of examples through humanity, because autocracies, dictatorships always end up taking away rather than building up. The one species or one culture throughout Europe that I found that continued to respect women and care for creation were the Celts. And once again, I've described how they spread all throughout Europe. Later, you would have people like Julius Caesar step forward. And he was a dictator autocrat, just like Sargon the Great. In his writings, he was constantly telling how uncivilized and how awful the Celts were because he was busy destroying their cities and stealing their possessions to build up his power so he could take up Rome. And finally, he got enough money and power to do that. And 2 months later, he was executed. So all his ambition, killing, destroying hundreds of thousands of people and their lives or enslaving them, is exactly what the Roman Empire did. And later it happened again and again. It's just sad that people who made such a difference. I found writings in Antoine, and what is really interesting is she said, because we are now enslaving and powerful other people, we can control the gods. And what you will find through humanity is this unhealthy relationship between religions and politics or governments. And whenever a government aligns itself closely with religion, you have the markings of these autocracies that can be so punitive. And many of us know example from church history where things just went bad. I mean, the Crusades and the Inquisition, if you look closely at it, it wasn't the churches or the faith people that came up with these concepts. It was the ruling powers of the day who appointed religious leaders who were lackeys who turned around and did what they liked. Of course, fortunately, we have nothing like that today. The one person who fled from this was Abraham. And it's interesting, the person he fled from, Nimrod, is credited with developing the Tower of Babel, which I don't think the emphasis of that story is on the building, but it's through autocracy that separates people. And different languages formed over time because each country separated themselves from each other. I've done a lot of talking right now. I want to pause for a while and just see what kind of questions come to mind. Or if everybody's fallen asleep or what have you. Questions?
I have to say, so far, this is just completely exceeding my expectations. So I appreciate it so much. And I know I'm glad it's being recorded because I know I'm going to watch it. And Nancy, please name it something really good to help capture, because the title of this talk does not capture the richness of just this combination of anthropology and the Enneagram. It's like my two favorite things have come together. And yeah, I just wanted to express gratitude. And I did have a question. Just about one of the books, because I've been writing down these books because some of them I read and they're amazing.
Nancy's going to send you a reading list that has all the books in it.
It's
Good,
actually
okay.
in the chat right now, and it's a
Okay.
file, so you can download it. It's not,
They're all there.
it's a file right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't realize what that file was. I see it. Yeah, I was just wondering about the guy you were talking about from Basque country. All right, I'll wait for it to open. But yeah,
That was
it's
earlier. Yeah.
very, very interesting. And I'm really getting a lot of connections. I feel like I've got like the richness of the 5 and the passion of the 8 all at once. I'm just really appreciating it.
But I hope some of the 2 comes through.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. No, the heart is there for
Yeah, right.
sure. And
I mean,
you're talking about the generosity and really what brings us together as people. I think you said the two was, you know, of the heart. I don't remember whether you said outer or world, but
High
I'm
heart,
getting,
High heart.
high
yeah,
heart.
right. Yeah.
When I say 4 is low heart, they keep it to them. It doesn't, they kill, but they are in touch with their heart. One example is I'm like a retired clergy, but I've always been struck by it said, and Mary kept these things in her heart. And I think there are certain things we always all keep in our hearts. But 4s, they have a treasure trove. I mean, they have riches of stories and experiences and perspective. And I think this is why I have found so many 4s to be such gifted storytellers. Um, because there's the depth of the narrative that is there. A healthy 4, I'm talking about. But we all try to be healthy in whatever way possible. Of course, your name means wisdom, as you know. And actually, in both the Old Testament and New Testament, the word for wisdom is always feminine. Sophia and Pneuma. Of course, there are some male scholars who say, no, it's a general term. It's like saying mankind includes everybody. Well, why don't you say everybody instead of using just mankind? And also, any other questions, Sophia or anyone else?
Not really a question, just some comments. So you said about 4,500, 4,000 years ago, they started slavery as an economic incentive.
Yeah, it
And,
became the model for humanity, or at
and,
least for Western civilization.
and you're saying that's what started the decline of civilization, was when they introduced slavery? Or am I
Yes.
misunderstanding? Okay, so
Yeah.
what I'm wondering is, which came first? They needed economic incentive for some reason, or they found slavery and said, "Hey, this is good for our economy." It might be too far back in history to know to answer that question, but to me it's an interesting idea. Which did come first? And then once one country discovered that slavery worked, well, of course, everyone else copied.
One country that kind of teetered back and forth, though, was Egypt. And Egypt had a long tradition of celebrating both men and women leaders. And if you look over Egypt's history, over 20 women played critical roles. But the two that played, I believe, the most important roles was Hatshepsut and Nefertiti. And both of them, like the Celts, created trade routes and connections with different people so that when Egypt experienced difficult time, it was the trade routes and the connections that they had established that saved the day. I think Dr. Klein, he's one of the books listed, has written 1179 BC. And he points out more detail of what I'm talking about. He's a professor in Maryland and well respected in the archaeology, anthropology work. In fact, I first heard him at the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, which is the original archaeology school in the United States. And it's the first place in America that archaeology was first considered a science. And I think what I believe the body of evidence that I'm hearing from the scientific, and I attend conferences of archaeologists, paleontologists, spiritual, whatever. It's just part of my passion. I'm a geek. And what I'm trying to do is summarize a number of things, but things that I'm talking about today are covered in numerous ways in the extensive reading list. I don't mean to overburden anyone. I think there's this recent book called Origins and movie. It had a different title, one or the other, but it talks about the impact of slavery upon African Americans and people of India, and then compares it to how the Jews have experienced. And what I'm really struck with, that is a pattern that we can trace all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia. It almost became the model. And the reason wasn't just economic. It was during time of climate crisis that dictatorships really began to expand. And in our world today, you will notice just a few years ago, there were 120 democracies around the globe. And a lot of them are beginning to crack. And I believe that there is an anxiety in the world about this growing climate crisis because it's entering into many of our lives. You know, we can't deny it anymore. I mean, our summers are warmer. We can see changes that are going on with the melting. And Gaia Vince, as I mentioned before, she's doing research on this, how we can survive. But what I've noticed over the past 5,000 years, the only people who survived during times of significant climate crisis, and it almost seems to happen every 1,600 years, have been the Celtic people. They find a way. And I'll get into that into a second. Any other questions?
I
Yeah.
have, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Oh,
No, I just want to go back to what you're talking about stories and how stories connect people. And many years ago, I went to a slide presentation of this couple who had gone to Timbuktu, which is, I know it's in Africa, I just forget where in Africa.
It's in
Anyways,
northern Africa along, I think, the Zambezi River, but it's actually the site of the first university, we believe, in Africa.
yeah. Well, they had gone to Timbuktu and they'd stopped, and it was the slideshow was pretty much looked to be the middle of nowhere. But about 5 minutes after they stopped for this rest break, they noticed people coming from all directions. And the tour guide said, okay, we're just going to be here a while. And they ended up staying, I don't know how long, but a lot longer than they thought, because people would just come from miles around with food, with clothes, with something, and take this as an opportunity to talk, to get to know these strangers, to see what was going on, and to share. And the other thing is, when it comes to the storytelling traditions, I'm somewhat familiar with indigenous or native ones, mainly Canadian, North American. But they also say the same thing, that in the winter months or even in the summer when they're celebrating, coming together to hear the stories of different tribes, of different groups, of this thing that happened on the earth so many years ago was the main part of the gathering. It was the main reason they would come. And you would have the Mohawk would tell the story from their point of view, and then the Chippewa would have it from their point of view, and the Haudenosaunee would have it from their point of view. And they're all basically telling a same story, but they're
You
also
are
telling
so
it from
right.
their own point of view based on their experiences.
You are so right. I think, Helen, though, I'd lift up to you is this summer was a radical discovery by the Smithsonian. The Blackfoot from Canada and Northern America, Montana, if you will, have always maintained that they were the first tribe to come to America. And they said that they were separate, and Smithsonian conducted studies because they had bones going back hundreds of years and modern. And what they were able to definitively show is the Blackfoot came to this country 18,000 years ago.
Mhm.
They would have come more from Finland. It's often thought that we know many Native Americans came from the Pacific, Asia theater, or there are the Russias. But this group came and they had maintained their story over 18,000 years. That means it was passed on. And there is a wonderful book about them and their spirituality. It's called a quantum physics professor studies the Blackfoot. It's a scholarly book I found. And it's important to know quantum because quantum physics doesn't go with simple, things that we observe, simple science, but it looks deeper in the connectivity with all things in the world, in the universe. And I would recommend that to you, Helen, if you're really intrigued with that. I too have, in fact, my doctoral studies was with a full professor of Native American spirituality. And that's a whole story into itself. But Norm Shofchuk he was the one who encouraged me to go deeper into Celtic spirituality. In fact, Norm wrote a book that is probably one of the best sellers for spiritual directors around the world. It's a guide for spiritual directors or people seeking God. It's by Norman Shawchuk, SHW. I'm sure he's listed on the list. But here's the intriguing thing is he talks about the rhythms of life and the patterns. There's a reading for each word, but he stretches your understanding of spirituality. And this was written over 30 years ago. And the one author he quotes from the most is one of the most Celtic authors I know in America today, and that's Richard Rohr. The name Rohr is Celtic, but also he's a Franciscan. And if you look at the backstory of the Franciscans, St. Francis of Assisi's mother was Gaelic. She was from France, Gaul. And an important part of his journey is she introduced him to the Gaelic troubadours, the songs, the bards. And you can see that had its impact with the beautiful poetry and the songs that St. Patrick, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace, and so on. So often there are things in our history or people. You look at the Franciscans, they don't have priests. They aren't part of the hierarchy. They are called also little brothers and sisters of the poor. And they align themselves with those who want a helping hand, but they are also known as great spiritual leaders. So if you go to Richard Rohr's website and you sign up for Celtic or Native American spirituality, you'll get the same emails because there's an interconnectedness. Should I move on, or is there any more questions?
Can I just ask one quick question?
Yeah.
So I don't know the origin of the diagram that I'm going to mention. So I just was introduced to this diagram. It's called the SINE, S-I-N-E, wave diagram of long-term history. Have you ever
No, I'd be interested.
seen this?
Once
So
again,
I'm just going to tell you why this intrigues me, because you mentioned 4,000 years ago, something shifted. And according to this diagram, 4,000 years ago, we were at a low time in what they're calling the kingdom of the world, or a very egoic, a very asleep period for this long-term wave of history. 2000, which, Y2K was, and the end of the Mayan calendar was the shift into now we're awakening. And so, but it was 4,000 years ago. And then, so the wave itself is 12,000. You mentioned 14,000, but oh my God, if we're talking, like that seems to be a reasonable, again, coincidence, like 10,000 years from 2000, from the year 2000, we were just leaving an awakened state, which, according to this, which would fit with what you're saying of the civilizations that are over 10,000 years old that are being, discovered all the time. I keep reading about, we're finding civilizations. Were they the same humans as us, or were they not? So I just wanted to share that. And then I just had one other quick question. at one point I went to go see the Cinque Terres in northern Italy.
It's wonderful, isn't it?
It is, but the reason I wanted to go there is I read, and I never could find where I read this, but that the original people who settled there were equalitarians. They ruled equally. And then as the story went, they completely disappeared and no one knows where they went, and then new people came and settled in. So anyway, just
Well,
thought, do you
there
think they were
were,
Celtics?
well, actually, Celtics, if you remember that map, were in northern Italy.
Yeah, that's
In
why I
fact,
said it.
in fact, the script that they used, we still use today. It's called italic. Italic script is Celtic, and it's from Italy. Just
Yeah.
like Hervakia is from Austria, and it's another time. But if you want to be enslaved, use Times Roman.
Oh, and that goes with, oh my gosh, I could talk more, but you finish your, yes, you, I have all these ideas.
Once again, Helen, you were asking, I've listed all the books in the file that's in the chat. So you have that list there. And I recommend that you check that out. So I'm going to share now again. And if I can find my place. This was easier. I'm using my wife's computer. I just bought a new one and mine went kerplunk.
Oh no.
Um, but that's all right. I have warranties and all that. You know, what really strikes me is the more I've done Celtic or Gaelic, as you want to call it, it's right here in the middle is where the Galatians lived. And Galatia is right next to Cappadocia. There was exchange going back and forth. But the capital of Celts, going back thousands of years, was right here in Turkey and a place called Ankara. Kara is like the original French coeur, which means heart. And the ana means to be lifted up, but it also means mother. One way, the word Anatolia means the motherland. Some of you remember World War II, they used the word fatherland. But we understand civilization and much of humanity that we develop in Western world comes from this area. And this is the origin of the word anchor. Is your life anchored in the heart that lifts you up? That's what anchor means. It is the heart and connected to one another, because that's what the feminine does, is pull us together. This is actually in northern Turkey or Armenia, but it's part of Anatolia. And this is supposedly where Noah was. Remember how I said all the waters rose 8,000 years ago? I believe, and there are professors who have written about this, that was the original flood theory. And it wasn't the flooding of the whole world. It was a whole flooding of their world. And when that happened, there were those who worked together and those who did not. But it's right about that time that something intriguing began to happen in parts of Anatolia. They started building underground cities. We have now discovered 200 underground cities that would hold anywhere from 20,000 to 70,000 people. And by the way, One of the cities we discovered was where Gurdjieff's father was from. In fact, in a book by Bennett, he says Gurdjieff took him back to where his father was born and showed him where they lived underground. When that was written, a lot of people didn't know about these underground cities. In fact, this was only discovered in 1964. Someone was building or expanding their basement, and suddenly the wall collapsed, and they find this maze. And with advanced sciences, we're finding not only these cities, but how these cities were interconnected. If you calculate it out, we know that hundreds of thousands, maybe as much as 500,000, maybe even 1 million people were living underground during time of climate crises. And what's so amazing about this is that they had water, they had drainage, they had storage, they had natural security built in, they had the wherewithal, the animals for making cheese. It was the Celts who originally developed cheddar and yogurt, which are helpful to the development of strong bodies. Just watch a yogurt commercial and you'll find out all about it. But what we're finding out is they found ways of living together in a healthy, positive way. Why is this important? And this is just some pictures. As I said, I was here in November. In fact, this is an example of they carved this out of volcanic rock called pumice that with stone implements, it would take one person their lifetime to carve out just one room. But it was the people from northern Anatolia related to the Celts that developed metallurgy. And they started digging. What I have found consistent between Sumerians and the Celts is excellent stone making and building of shelters underground. They would put the animals at the top. And what I found intriguing is they would, as they carved it out, they would leave a round rock that could be rolled in to block anyone entering. And we know that these were used because there was, in Herodotus writing 2,500 years ago, one of the original, Herodotus came up with the concept of history, the word history itself. But in his writings, he said, and there are the Celts who live underground. Also, in 1906, there was a New York Times reporter there in Cappadocia, and an invading army was coming through, and the village people said, come with us, and they went underground. The invading army came and they looted the town above hand because that's all they wanted. And they couldn't find anyone. They figured they went out into the hills. So they kept going. And later on, the people came out and they survived. I think the Celts have found ingenious ways over time to deal with problems, just like Göbekli Tepe is coming together to deal with the problems that faced them. That is something I have seen in the Celtic, and I believe that is something critical to the Enneagram community. Because I'm someone who practiced ministry in dozens of different faith communities over the years. I have never seen healings like I've seen in the Enneagram community. People who are struggling and other people who are helping them, guide them to find a better life, a better way. I have found the best of the Enneagram community are those who understand that generosity spirit. And the Enneagram teaches us, each of us, about the things of each number or type that's good and beautiful. But it also teaches us the things that can be bad or ugly. And, you can't go completely one way without, nobody is the complete package. I think what Dr. Siegel is saying is we need each other. And he'll be coming out next month with a book on Enneagram, but he'll look at it from a neurological perspective. And I encourage you to look. This is the bedroom I stayed in. It was very comfortable, thank you. and I didn't need a skylight. Um, one book that I find very helpful, and I've shared this with other scholars, is a lot of people have questioned who Homer was. And I don't think Homer was a person, was a collection of Celtic Nobel Prize winners, Yeats and Joyce, that the Odyssey had to be Celtic because the Celtic way shares the story of not superheroes, but how broken people are restored to health. I really love Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey.
Bob,
As
can I stop you for a second? Your
Yeah,
internet is choppy again, and I wonder if you turn off your picture.
I will. I did.
If
Does that
if
help?
w- I'm still seeing you. You took down the slideshow. Try that. Yeah, try that.
I did. Yeah. Can you see
Okay.
me all right now?
Yes, I can
Okay.
see you okay, and I'm hearing you okay.
Let,
We were missing a few words.
in the book of the Odyssey,
There you go.
it starts out by a broken man. Ulysses says, I'm broken. And he says that the gods are useless, the Greek gods. And I'm not going to follow them anymore. And he begins a journey to find wholeness. And in that, he visits 9 different places and 9 different types of people. But all the way through the story, there are women guiding his way to health. You see, he had been involved in the Trojan War. And we know that something happened 3,200 years ago in the area of Troy, but all around the Mediterranean. That one book by Klein called 1179 BC talks about how all the civilizations around the Mediterranean collapsed because of global warming at that time.
Mm.
And what happened was, rather than working together to find solutions, there were some who said, well, I'll just steal from someone else. And what that ended up happening is a collapse. There was only one country in the Mediterranean that survived, and once again, that's Egypt. And Klein details it was because of women leaders who established trade routes throughout Africa that saved the day for Europe or for Egypt. But Greece was decimated, what would be known as Rome or whatever. In fact, up to 50 to 60% of the world's population died because of famine, because of the heat. It's interesting that 1,600 years later, there was another global warming, and that led to what we know as the Dark Ages. And it is now 1,600 years later. And we are about to enter time of global warming. And what I postulate to you, to humanity, is can we find a way to work together? If you read Dr. Siegel's book, Interconnected, he says that when we are balanced, our body, mind, heart, and spirit, and when we interact, when we are interconnected with each other in a healthy way, that extraordinary things can happen. He points out that it is generosity of spirit that has enabled us to develop as a species. And we can now, paleontologists, just within the past 2 years, have announced we can trace that hospitality and generosity of spirit back 4 million years. You've heard of Lucy? Well, her tribe practiced hospitality, her people, because we can see through the DNA that they welcomed up in people from other tribes and other traditions. I also want to put this out for you is when people were coming up from Africa, we know that there was some intermingling in the Mideast between Neanderthal and what would become known as Homo sapiens. But actually, we find that the Neanderthal were basically separatist. In fact, most Neanderthals died out about 40,000 years ago. And there are a couple theories. One is because they did not intermix with different cultures. And they actually, if you intermarry, diseases can enter in. You leave yourself vulnerable. You know, I hear these people talk about misogyny or mixing of the races. And actually, for the Celtic way, that was a way of life. It was health in trading ideas, in intermarrying and sharing cultures, in being open to the possibilities because they understood we are all one humanity. I think this is a helpful message for us today. And one that I've had the opportunity to share with a lot of people in their 20s and 30s and such. And I think it's somewhere along this line. To be Celtic doesn't mean any one authority. It's always the bottom up. And instead of someone else being our savior or rescuing us, it's like each one of us can make a difference to step forward, to do what we can. I find, Nancy, you are very Celtic in your practices by your messages and your reaching out. You know, Celtic, you don't have to be Irish or kiss me on from Ireland or anything. Once again, it was Dr. Paxson in her series that's part of the Great Lecture. It says there are some people that just adapted or adopted Celtic way. And one of the best examples I know in ancient history was Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great is recognized as one of the greatest leaders, benevolent leaders of antiquity. He came into power in areas that would include Iran and developed what we know as the Persian Empire. But it's interesting, as a boy, he had to be hidden away and he grew up in the mountains with the shepherds, the same area that the Celts came from. And remember how I was saying how the Celts had ways of organizing? Through a sequence of events, he became leader of the early Persian Empire, and he set up ways of organizing and democratic renewals. And the Jews who were enslaved, he set them free and gave them money to go back build a temple. In fact, in Jewish history, he is the only one who is called the Anointed One. They reserve that for their prophets, but they feel that power of God went through them. I just find a parallel, and you can look up articles in Jerusalem Times or Irish Times, that they've noticed that there is a close connection between Jews and Celts because both of them are people of the story, and they are both freedom-loving people. They also worshiped only one God, and both of them refused to bow down to someone else. That has been porn for both of them. And here is what just fascinated me. I think Isaac Newton was one of the greatest geniuses in humanity. But all the time he was forming his research and all that, he was reading documents from Anatolia because the Ottoman Empire was moving in and people and documents were finding their way throughout Europe. I don't know what he had, but I'm sad because when he died, those who were supposedly his friends went through his papers, and anything to do with Mesopotamia, they burned because they didn't want him to be branded a heretic. And just like the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, what a loss. But as we as anthropologists, is sometimes we don't need the documents. We can see it in the actions, because actions tell us a whole lot. And what fascinates me is that Isaac Newton dedicated the remainder, the last years of his life, of looking for healthy models for civilization. And in the last book he wrote, the last chapter, he says he found such sustenance in Brehon law, which was from the Irish. There was one genius to Sir Isaac Newton, a lot of people don't realize. He understood the movement of bodies and how they connected to each other, the universe and planets and all that. But also, he understood human dynamics. And at one point, England was bankrupt, and they asked him to be in charge of the monetary systems, the banks. He was the head of the scientific community in London at that point. And actually, he's the one discovered currency. That in order to have a good economy, you have to have flow of money, currency. So you prime the economy, you prime the pump, you deposit, you get money flowing. And that's what led to England being the powerhouse. It wasn't great kings and queens. They learned the importance of connecting with others, and they used the waterways just like the Celts. And it was spreading. I'm not saying that the English government was Celt. It was almost like Celt light, because they still had royalty. And, I really want King Charles to be the spiritual leader of my life. Not so. In England, the kings and queens have always been head of the military and the church and the government. And that's too much of a conflict. They do have parliament, which was essentially a democracy, but their parliament has often been run by business people. That's why when they got into financial crises, they decided to tax the Americans, which led to the Revolutionary War. I want you to note that at Valley Forge, with George Washington, this is according to Professor McKnight, Osborne McKnight, 75% of the men at Valley Forge in the toughest of times were Celtic, including my 5th great-grandfather, who was a 14-year-old kid who cared so much about freedom, he wasn't old enough to enlist, so he stuffed the cannon. It was called a madras. Each one of us, in our own way, have to step up and enable freedom for all people, all culture, all language in this country and around the world. And I'm not going to tell you who to vote for next week, but I think you have a strong suspicion who I'm aligned with. Oh, by the way, I couldn't help but notice is Kamala's father came from Jamaica. Do you know who originally settled Jamaica? The Irish. In fact, Kamala's father even acknowledges Irish heritage. But you know what? You don't have to be related by blood or DNA simply to be a caring, generous person. And that's what makes the difference in this world. I just want to close with one idea and open any last questions. In Dr. Siegel's book, Interconnected, he says, when we work together collaboratively and cooperatively, the sum of the results is greater, the total is greater than the sum of the parts. And it's almost like, you can call it different terms, but I just call it magic, because in this formula that he describes, it's like 5 + 5 = 16. I think we are the most creative and innovative when we don't try to solve everything by ourselves, but we work collaboratively together. And I am a Strength Finders coach with Gaelic. I've gone through all the training and all that. I mean, I had to drop 20,000 to get to this level and years of study, but it's worth it. But what I'm intrigued is, one, Strength Finders is similar to Enneagram in that you answer a bunch of questions, and then it tells you what your strengths are, and it breaks them down into body, mind, heart, and spirit. They use different words. They have 9 different ways of thinking. They call it strategic. They had 9 different ways of feeling or heart. They call it relationships. They have 9 different ways of body functioning. They call it the executive function. And what I have helped people do is connect this with themselves. Because if you take Strength Finders, nobody on the planet's going to be just like you. In fact, there are so many different variations of the 34 types. There's a different type for every drop of water on this planet, let alone people. It's that mathematical. And I will never meet anyone just like me, but Strength Finders helps me understand what makes me unique, but it also helps me inform why you're unique, each one of us. And their Strength Finders is becoming standard in universities across the world for one reason. Because clinical studies show students who use it increase their graduation rates by 10%. The average college university graduates only 50% of the student body. This boosted up to 60%. And I believe if it got integrated with the Enneagram, it would go even higher. I find the Enneagram helps us know our stories and each other's stories. And I find Strength Finders is very thinking way of getting at it. And it's almost like, remember body, mind, and heart? I think these 2 tools address the heart and the head. But for me, I find it's the Celtic tradition or the ancient indigenous practices of humanity. There's a great research paper from the National Institute of Health on Violence, and it traces it through civilizations and human history. And it basically says it's a virus. It's catching, and it can spread. And with violence is always accompanied lies and loss. And I believe that the reason these ancient indigenous societies flourish so much is because that they were able to work together and minimize those losses, but also find ways through the most difficult of times. I know I've reached our end. Any last questions? And I appreciate everybody's time here.
We so appreciate you. Go ahead, Helen.
Yeah, well, first off, I just love your passion for this topic, Bob. It's really very, very obvious. And to your last point about ancient indigenous things, this idea of the wampum belt was a contract between the natives and the settlers coming in from wherever they came from, saying that we would work together. We would each have our own identities, but we would work together to manage to live life with the land, not on it, to live life with the land and to live life with each other. And that goes back to everything you've been saying about the working together. And at the same time, there's an old story attributed to Margaret Mead, who was very, very excited when she found a healed femur bone that was however many thousands years old, because she said, this is a sign of civilization. This is a sign of people caring and sharing and working together to keep this individual alive.
And subsequently, we found even more evidence, and some of them much older. And that's that generosity of spirit, Helen. You're right. It's what helps us. It's caring. It's the 2 function to reach out. You know, we all have each number in us. But as Dr. Siegel points out, somewhere along the line, we tend to stress one number over the others. But as a spiritual director, what I help people to do is understand stories in their lives that align with the different numbers so they get a comprehensive understanding. As an 8, I can tell you how I became an 8 and how it manifested. But the richness is in the 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and so on. It's,
Exactly.
in fact, the rosary was developed during the plague, and they were 150 beads, and you'd read each psalm. And that's what the original rosary was. But in a parallel way, what I have those that I work with as a spiritual director, and I teach at seminaries and young, a lot of people. I primarily teach in groups, but I have them each day or each important decision go through the 9 types. What helps is the strength finders, if helps me even narrow that even more. So with the strengths, I understand my 8 or my 9 or my 7 and so on much better, because your 7 may be different than my 7 and so on down the line. But isn't this listening to nature? Isn't that the Celtic way? And what has been true about the Celts are helping through times of transition. St. Bridget was known as the gateway through important stages of life. And I think as humanity, we're reaching that point. Teilhard de Chardin, who came from France, who grew up in the area that was where the center, where the Celts lived in France. And many great leaders, came from that area. But what I appreciate about his genius is he said that because of technology and communication and science, he firmly believed that we're becoming better informed about where we came from. And the more we listen to it and each other, the better the hope for humanity. He called it the Omega, Alpha, the completion of where we began is where we end up as a humanity that cares for each other and the planet. And don't anyone ever tell you, there's a Celt saying, that you were born in a sin or you have original sin. You are part of creation. You are good. You are blessed. In fact, the ancient word blessed means to treat each other with humility. In fact, to receive a blessing, you had to kneel in ancient times because of that humility entering in. And what I believe it's when we're humble with each other, that's when the blessings truly flow. Thank you for tonight.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Sophia and Sang and Helen. Thank you.
Thank you. Y'all have a good night and